In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Two of these readings we have today are very important for the kind of history of salvation. The first one is the one from Genesis chapter 17, and the other one from the Gospel. Starting with the one from Genesis 17, we have here a story of the promise to Abraham, and part of the reason we know it's so important for us as Christians is because St. Paul picks it up twice in his writings, both in the book of Romans and also in the book of Galatians, and both of those two books are kind of the cornerstone of St. Paul's thinking and theology, and the way he sort of develops the foundation of what was to become mainstream Christian thinking. And St. Paul points out, and it always comes as a slight shock to me, really, when he says the story of Abraham is a completely different thing from the giving of the law. And it's obvious, really, but somehow it's hard for that to sink in, at least into my mind. Paul says the story of Abraham, the response of Abraham to God, comes 400 years before the law. 400 years. The giving of the law is in a completely different book of the Bible. It's in the book of Exodus, which comes way later than the book of Genesis, or the stories at least reflected in the book of Genesis. So Paul is saying, how can the law then possibly be the foundation of Christian spirituality when it came 400 years after the history of faith and the story, salvation history, began? He's saying, no, the story of Abraham is what is the corner of our faith, and it comes simply because Abraham believed God, because he believed God and responded to God. So it's not a question of obeying the commandments. It's a question of believing God. When on the other hand, when we have the gospel reading here in Mark's gospel, it's very important for the Gospel of Mark, and you can see that in part because it comes about the middle of the book. St. Mark, the Gospel of Mark has 16 chapters in it, and this is, as you can see, chapter 8. So it's more or less the middle of the Gospel. And you often find that the middle, if you're trying to work out what one of the books of the Bible is really all about, you'll often find its main themes at the beginning, at the end, and in the middle. So here in the middle of Mark's Gospel, we have this story of what we call the first passion prediction. There are 3 times that Jesus predicts that he will suffer on the cross, and this is the first one. So all the way up to these 8 chapters up to here, we've been hearing of the healing miracles that Jesus did. We've been seeing his works of power as the Son of God. And here he turns and says, now it's time for me to go to Jerusalem. And it comes because he is acclaimed as the Messiah. It says, you see, who do you say I am? Peter says, we say you're the Messiah. And then Jesus says, there I can go to Jerusalem. So there's the response, and immediately the next line, he says, now I can go to Jerusalem to die on the cross. It's the hinge point of the gospel. And Jesus says here, for us to be following him, there are three things that characterize the life of a disciple who's following him. And it's interesting that it's open here. There's no pressure. There's no forcing anybody to follow along behind him. It's a choice which we make. But if we choose to follow him, there are 3 characteristics according to this passage. One is to renounce ourselves, to lay aside our own self-interest. Secondly, to accept the cost, to pick up our cross that Christ gives us. And thirdly, that we follow him in the way that he is going to the crucifixion. First is to renounce ourselves, second to accept the cross, and thirdly to follow the Son of Man to the crucifixion. And that really applies to all three of these people that appear in these passages. It applies to Abraham and to Sarah. It applies to Jesus himself, and it applies to St. Paul. Abraham has to leave his home to follow God's call, and then he suffers the cost of that because he no longer has everything that he did have back in the land of the Chaldees. And then thirdly, he follows God's call. So it's a journey behind God, and he believes God. Secondly, with Jesus, obviously, he renounces himself. We have that in the story of the 40 days in the wilderness. He accepts the cost. He takes his cross. And thirdly, he follows God's call to him. And then St. Paul, of course, he renounces himself. He steps away from his own secure background. He suffers. He himself was executed in Rome, and he follows God's call on his missionary journeys. So those characteristics that Jesus speaks about exist in all three of these kind of accounts. And also in the story, if you look at the front of the prayer book, you see there the calendar, the church's calendar, all the people that we look up to. I suppose there would be about 200 of them who we take as examples of the Christian faith. And one of them comes from this last Monday, was Polycarp, who was burned to death just after this, about early in the 2nd century, because he followed Christ. So there again, those characteristics follow on into the life of the church and into our own lives too. One of the reasons why Mark is setting this forward to the disciples there in Rome, as I've said before, is because they themselves are facing persecution. They themselves are facing persecution. And so when Jesus speaks here about carrying your cross, being crucified for the faith, and that God's promises will be kept through this, he's speaking to this community who itself is under persecution. It's interesting here that we have this phrase, the Son of Man. It has a very complex history in the Bible, and shades of meaning, and it's used in different ways in different places. And one of the things it is it's representative. Instead of translating it as the Son of Man, you could say a representative individual. A representative individual is ransomed and many benefit. And why that's significant in terms of the community that Mark is writing to, it's as if he's part of the meaning here may be that he's saying to them, when you suffer, that congregation in Rome, when it was being persecuted, that the suffering of that congregation itself somehow set forth the gospel. That was like Jesus being on the cross. What they were going through also set forth God's salvation. They were also a representative person. And their suffering would be for the ransom of many people. And I think you see that, why would anybody do it? You've got to ask yourself, it's not a good marketing campaign to say, come and follow Jesus, because we're all heading for the cross. It's not an appeal for it. Why would we do that? Why would we renounce ourselves? Why would we accept that cost? Why would we follow the call of God in this journey of salvation? And the answer that Paul is saying, that comes from the story of Abraham, is because God keeps the divine promises. That's why we do it. If we follow our own way, there's no divine promises that are going to be kept there. When we follow in the way that Abraham began for us, then the day comes in which we see those divine promises fulfilled. And you can see it's true. I mean, at times that we all have our times of doubt. But if you look at the story of Abraham, who can doubt that God's promises were kept? Look, from that tiny little family out in the middle of the desert, nations did spring up. Even when, they must have had their doubts. The first promise here to Abraham about the coming of the son, he was about 84 years old. Then her whole 15 years go by and nothing happens. It's no wonder that Sarah thought, well, maybe we should try with the slave girl, because nothing's happening here. 15 years. And then those people come again, the three people, the divine individuals come to Abraham's tent and say, this time next year you will have a son. And you can imagine, why wouldn't Sarah laugh? She sits outside. I've heard this one before. You can imagine her saying, 15 years we've been trying. I wish he would stop all these religious promises and so on and settle down and just get used to the fact we aren't going to have any kids. So she laughs. Now, it just struck me, there's a lovely little section at the end of Genesis 17 there. Some beautiful, quirky little parts of the Bible story. If I was in school and I, let's say, stole somebody's pencil and then happened to meet God afterwards and I knew it was God, and God said to me, why did you steal Timothy's pencil? I mean, you'd have to be stupid to say, I didn't. But she says that to God. She lies to God. I would think that's a bit of a pointless exercise. And so the divine figure just repeats to her, you did laugh. You did laugh. And the name of the child, Isaac, means laughter. So the whole of that story becomes laughter. But God keeps his promises, despite the fact that she lied right there, despite the fact she couldn't believe it anymore. God still kept his promises. And that's why we follow on behind Jesus Christ, because he keeps his promises. God kept his promise to Jesus. Jesus couldn't have known for sure that he would have been resurrected. So, in fact, some of the ways in which it's predicted, there is a certain amount of uncertainty. He says, God will do something with my death, but there's a certain level of uncertainty even for him. There, we see it in Gethsemane, where he says, I wish I didn't have to do this. Just what St. Peter says to him in this passage. This shouldn't happen to you. Finally, he got to the point. I wish this cup could pass away from me. If he was sure he was going to be raised 2 days later, he wouldn't have been that worried about it, would he? There's some kind of uncertainty or ambiguity there for him. But in the end, he, like Abraham, believes God and goes ahead into the crucifixion. And of course, as the passage says, his life becomes a ransom for many. Look at the many that have come from Jesus. And finally, St. Paul. Once again, he got depressed in Ephesus. He must have thought, I must be wasting my time here. I'm making no progress at all, for many different reasons. But goes forward believing God. And look from the life of St. Paul, what fruits there have come. And so it will be for us too. We have the same challenge. Jesus says, if you follow me, God will keep his promises. And that's why we do follow him. I just like to read, which just caught me. We have two prefaces for Lent that you'll hear said during the Eucharistic prayer. They're on page 379. And they might be just good kind of meditation pieces for you in your prayer life during this Lent. At the top of page 379. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, who was tempted in every way as we are, yet did not sin. By his grace we are able to triumph over every evil, and to live no longer for ourselves alone, but for him who died for us and rose again. And the other one, you bid your faithful people cleanse their hearts and prepare with joy for the Paschal feast, that fervent in prayer and in works of mercy, and renewed by your word and sacraments, we may come to the fullness of grace, which you have prepared for those who love you. So let us, during this Lent, anew, put ourselves in the second place. Be prepared to take our cross, to bear our testimony for Jesus Christ, and to follow him on the way to Jerusalem. In the name of Christ, amen.